We've got an election coming up. You may not have noticed it coming in November, and it looks like it's going to be Joe Biden versus Donald Trump once again. Give us your sense, having been in the White House, what difference does it make? Because it occurs to me sometimes I think we put too much pressure on the president and the White House. They can't control everything in the economy. How much of a difference does it really make?
Well, look, I don't know if this election is going to be decided on policy and policy differences, but it should be, because if you look at the difference between these two candidates, the differences are as stark as certainly any election in modern history. We've got President Biden's got a basic approach to the economy that he has laid out, and now you can see. We're talking about significant investment in industrial renewal in the United States, a commitment to the idea that public investment in things like infrastructure, things like clean energy, a build out of the semiconductor industry will help to expand productive capacity, ultimately expand real wage growth. And that's his strategy. And then, frankly, it's consistent with who he is and how he's approached the economy for some time. Candidate Trump, on the other hand, is a dramatic departure. And the thing that I think we're probably paying insufficient attention to is at a moment where prices are the top issue on Americans' minds, and we've finally seen real progress in bringing inflation down and bringing prices down. The basic Trump approach of protectionism, all across the board, indiscriminate tariffs, shutting down immigration, and raising costs like healthcare costs by getting rid of pharmaceutical regulations, getting rid of the Affordable Care Act, is a recipe for significant inflationary pressures in the economy and price increases for typical families. So, I think that that's a real short-term effect and a real difference between these two candidates.
So let's talk about a couple of those, if we could. And they are immigration and they are protectionism, as you put it, on trade. President Biden has not really dialed back substantially on the tariffs put in place under President Trump, as I recall. And certainly when it comes to China, it doesn't sound like they have a very different position. Is there really a difference when it comes to trade between these two men?
I think there is. I think it's pretty stark. President Biden has had a sort of a basic two-part approach when it comes to trade, which is, one, have a very targeted approach to protecting American interests, economic and national security, when it's warranted, and two, really committing to work with partners and allies to try to build more capability and effectiveness when that is the case. So if you look at something like semiconductors, the Trump administration really didn't take any action when we were looking at sensitive dual-use technologies that were potentially getting in the hands of the Chinese or other adversaries. The Biden administration came in, President Biden came in and said, I am going to put a stop to that, but I'm going to work with my allies and partners to do so, because otherwise it's fundamentally ineffective. You contrast that with the Trump approach, which it's still emerging, so we'll have to see what happens on the campaign. But if it does turn out that what we're talking about is a 10% across-the-board tariff on all products coming into the United States from allied countries, from countries or from products where we don't produce anything here in the United States, a cup of coffee, that is a very extreme and new step. You talk about completely eliminating permanent normal trade relationships with China. Candidate Trump has said at times, I want to literally eliminate all imports from China, period, end stop. The macroeconomic impact of those steps would be significant, potentially a couple of points off of GDP. And the practical impact on those for families would be quite significant too. People would start to see it. And I think that general Trump approach is one of core isolationism, which is not only to erect those barriers, but basically to alienate our allies in the process. That creates, potentially larger risks across the board. So I think that the top line, there's not that much difference in them on trade, is a complicated position when you unpack it.
And what about immigration? There was a time there seemed to be a very big difference between them. Former President Trump certainly would say there's a big difference, but it feels like President Biden has moved toward the position of President Trump. Is there a big difference at this point? Isn't any president going to have to address that southern border no matter what?
100%, the border will need to be addressed, and it'll need to be addressed in a appropriate and aggressive way. I think the big difference in what I worry about is with respect to the legal immigration system. So one of the significant things we've seen over the past couple of years, the reason why we've seen significant increases in labor supply and labor force participation, it's legal immigration has come back after COVID and after the Trump administration, as well as more women coming into the workforce. That process of legal immigration that is now normalized, and the Biden administration prioritized, for example, working down visa backlogs and trying to get to a more normal system. I think under a Trump administration, you could expect that to revert. And I think in addition to that being bad for innovation and bad for broader economic growth, it could also be quite inflationary in the short term, because what you're doing is constricting labor supply at a moment where we need more workers in the United States. Our legal immigration system has been an engine for growth for decades, for a long time. I think that there would be a big difference on that front, because I think you're right. With respect to the southern border, it will need to be addressed. It'll need to be addressed in a realistic but aggressive way.
What about fiscal policy? I mean, as you said, President Biden has really pursued a policy of investment, which is amounted to fiscal stimulus as a practical matter. There's a fair amount that's still to be expressed. It hasn't come through the system yet. Is there a big difference in addressing the deficit and the debt? Because a lot of people, at least on Wall Street, are pretty concerned about it at this point.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's reason for concern. The biggest difference here is with respect to tax policy, and there the numbers are very large. So if you look at, there's a recent analysis of what would it look like for Trump policy to go into effect if you're talking about both extending the Trump tax cuts that were put in place in 2017, many of which expire in 2025. And then you add on to that things that Trump has been talking about to include a reduction in the corporate tax rate to 15%. All told, that would be about $4.6 trillion in additional tax cuts over a decade. That's almost 2 percentage points of GDP. It would take our revenue down below 15% of GDP. Very different from what a President Biden is talking about, where he's talking about actually trying to increase taxes, raise that corporate tax rate back up from 21 closer to 28%, increase taxes on the very wealthy by a significant amount. That could raise a couple of $1 trillion. So that gap between the two is well over $5 trillion. That will be a line of debate and a line of demarcation in 2025. But given the fiscal backdrop we have, I think if the market actually internalizes the idea that we're not going to do anything about the Trump tax cut extension, and in fact, we're going to come and we're going to layer on that with additional tax cuts, then I think that you'll start to see that in impact on long-term borrowing costs, because it will send a signal that we don't really have any serious plan to address the revenue shortfalls we have in this country.